Hello there, YouTube. This is Mr. Gibson Guy with you. Thanks for stopping by again. I have been doing a series of videos on the Minolta manual focus SLR cameras. And I've been covering just about everything now. I'm going back to the past here with this one. I think this is probably the last video on these histories of different Minolta models. But today we're looking at, right here in front of you, one of the more historic ones, meaning the real oldies here. This is the Minolta SR2, the SR202. I'm sorry, yeah, I gotta say the full name. There's an SR2 also. That's a different one. The Minolta SRT series started, I believe, around 1956, and it was the first single lens reflex camera to bring SLR photography to the masses, meaning that it was pretty inexpensive. Stuff from Japan in the 1950s was pretty low priced, and so they made some kind of cool stuff that cost a fraction of what it cost if you got it from Germany or England or the US. And that kind of got them into the market. The Minolta SRT series and the Pentax Spotmatic camera, which was going along similar to the SRT. Those were the two cameras that were the biggest selling cameras all through the 1960s. Now, the original SR was a single lens reflex, but it did not have a light meter involved in the single lens reflex stuff. They had like a separate attached or unattached light meter that's stuck on the side of the camera, and you can set it and get your exposure setting and then set your dials so the camera will do it. But in, I believe it was 1966, the SR added the letter T, and that stood for through the lens, because that was when Minolta introduced the SR through the lens T that included the light meter inside the pentaprism of the camera, and the light metering was done through the lens in the camera for the very first time. And Minolta did that, and that's what's got the whole ball rolling. So the SR to the SRT, and then the 66, that introduced the first of them, the SRT 101, and then the SRT 102 and SRT 100, as they went through various models that had more or less goodies on it from the basic camera. But they made lots of those cameras. Pentax and Minolta were just ruling photography in the 1960s with that stuff. But they could see what was happening, and that was that things were going to be going electronic. And their first one, and that actually took about 10 years of development, so it had to start in the late 1950s, and then came out in 1972. It was the X1. This was the beginning. I got two of them here, X1 and X1. The X1 is also called the XK or the XM, and also with the motor it was called the XM motor, because these did not have motor drives with them. But these cameras had an electronically controlled shutter. This was the first of them when they started doing that. And they had various degrees of success in doing these, because everybody was developing stuff and they had to try to keep up with each other. And as soon as they thought they had it ready to release, they come up with something else they'd have to do, so it just got withheld. But in '72, I believe it was, they first came out with the very first X series cameras. And then the next year, they came out with their new XE series cameras, which took this one, but instead of all the problems with the removable finder as this professional model, for general photography they put on what this even looks like. You can see like it's a removable finder, but it's not. Like it looks like it's normal here, and then it looks like one of these here, but it doesn't come off. So everything is connected to the whole camera body. Didn't have to make those artificial connections. And then a couple years later, they came out with the XD series, which is still in the X series, but the XD was a considerably more refined camera than this, and it set the new standards. It did not have an optional motor drive, but it had an optional auto winder. It also had flash sync built into it, so when you had the camera going on automatic and you turned your flash on that was plugged into the hot shoe, that the flash would automatically set the camera to flash sync of 1/60th of a second. And so that's how they started getting cameras with dedicated flash, dedicated winders, dedicated lenses, all this stuff. And that's what happened. And after this, because this came out against the Canon AE1, and the Canon AE1 was something very different because it was an all-electronic series of cameras built on the A platform. Similar cameras with some aperture priority, some shutter priority, some manual mode, manual exposure control, and mixture of aperture and shutter speed, so they can make programmed exposure, which this kind had, they just didn't say it. But Minolta came out with this one that went alongside the XD11, but much lower price, and that was the XG7. And that was, as I said, like an A series camera. It was all electronic. It was very cheap to assemble. It didn't take nearly the craftsmanship and work that these other cameras required from a different time. All these mechanical cameras and all these very advanced features on these cameras, everything got to be done electronically. And it was a matter, some people called it the race to the bottom. How cheaply could you make your camera so it could compete with the A series by Canon? And the Minolta XG7, then they fancied it up a little bit with the XG9, then they did a strip version of the XG1, and they just sold the heck out of those XG series cameras. They weren't very great cameras, but everybody bought them, and they were very cheap, very easy to use. So then that carries us to 1981, and the XG finally gets morphed into the X700, and this is based on the XG7 platform, but it has much more modern electronics in it. It has a real program mode on it. It has through the lens flash. For the first time you can get a motor drive that goes with your camera so that you can burn through a lot of film really fast. And this gave you all the bells and whistles. Then they gave you a slightly stripped down one of the X570 and a 370 as a base one. And now notice from the dates that we zipped through all these cameras. And next year's model, they kept coming out with new ones. But they came out with this one in 1981. And after all these cameras came and went in very short order, the X700 stayed in production and on sale for 20 years, longer than any other one. So that was kind of interesting how it was rushed. Another camera, new camera, new camera, new camera, new camera, and we'll just stick with that. And that's because after they made this, they put all their efforts into autofocus, and they no longer developed manual film cameras, but manual exposure film, manual focus film cameras were still in demand and still selling, a lot of people didn't want to mess with the autofocus. And then of course it changes into the electronic, the digital cameras, and a lot of people don't want to mess with those. But these cameras that came along in the early 80s, same thing with Olympus, same thing with Nikon. Well, Nikon's still making some, I understand, but they kept going right into the millennium and beyond, into a new century and a new millennia. So that was a story on those. Back to this one, where we started. See, they all came from this SRs. And this, the 202 was the last of the SR cameras, the last one that they came up with. And this was a really deluxe one. There was a 102, which was very similar to this one. Difference is this one, I think, has X-Sync, and those just had a hot shoe that didn't have a hot contact on it. So the SR200 series were these. The 200 itself didn't have this. It had just a little ASADIN chart, but not a place to put your film cover, box cover. And it did not have the self-timer lever. It was like this. Mechanical times. Click, the button comes back up. Pop, there we go. So that was a very advanced feature on the day. The 102 had over here, just like an Olympus OM1, it had a little lever that you twist, and that would lock up the reflex mirror inside the pentaprism. When they came out with the 202, they deleted that. Only the 102 had the mirror lockup, and the mirror lockup became kind of a dinosaur as far as, well, you know, people use it. Really, you use a tripod, you use a cable release, and you don't worry about mirror lockup. That was because they were still making some new lenses back in the old days that extended so far into the camera that it went right up to the shutter curtain inside the camera, the end of the lens, and you couldn't put it on with the mirror in the way. So you had to either have a mirrorless camera or you had to have mirror lockup. But Nikon long stopped making those extended lenses, so they said, what do we need the mirror lockup for? But what Minolta did with this that was not on the 102 was that this was the only SRT camera which would do double exposure or intentional multi-exposure. But the way that they did it, that was kind of a curious thing. The way they did it was you would make your exposure, and then you would press this button down here, the rewind button, like that, and you tighten up your film here until it was pulled taut, and then you would wind it again. This wouldn't move because the film was not going. See, this will pop. Well, this will pop up when I punch it out. But the only problem with that is that if you're seriously thinking about doing any double exposure or intentional multi-exposure on your same piece of film, almost invariably, to do it at all correctly, you have to do it with your camera mounted on a tripod, because the camera can't move from one exposure to the other. It's got to stay in the same place. And you can't push this button under the camera when this is on the tripod. So putting multi-exposure on this camera you could have it there, but you couldn't really do any serious double exposure work because you have to be able to press that button or do some sort of release so you can wind the film without moving the camera. And you have to move the camera to get to that button when the camera's mounted on a tripod. All right, so this camera is gets compared a lot current day, contemporarily, to the K1000, but this is a much better camera than the K1000 because the K1000, Pentax K1000, has so much recognition as being a great mechanical manual camera. The prices are way higher than they were on that camera when it was new, which was crazy. Minolta SRTs are probably the last of the really reasonably priced great cameras that you can get out there. If you are interested in learning film photography, manual exposure, you are the photographer, not the camera. The best camera you can get is the SRT 202. These didn't sell very well. There's not many of them out there. But on the other side of the coin, these things are real tanks. They're very tough cameras. They stand up to everything. All the controls are very simple. Everything is very easy to operate and to understand. And this gives you some really great goodies that you wouldn't find in the 100 or 200. That is that in the viewfinder, down at the bottom, there is all your shutter speeds and a little caliper that moves back and forth that points out to you what shutter speed your camera is set on this dial. You don't have to look at the dial, you can read it in the viewfinder. And only to the 102 and 202, it has the ADR, Aperture Direct Readout, which takes these little aperture numbers on the Minolta lens and shows that in the viewfinder. So you can see what your set aperture is and what your set shutter speed is without ever taking your eye out of the finder. You won't do that on a K1000. You won't do that on hardly any cameras now. This is a very advanced features on this. Of course, it takes all the interchangeable lenses, unless you happen to have one that requires a mirror lockup, and Minolta didn't do any of those. So that was Nikon that was making everybody do that. So this is a very sturdy camera, a very well-appointed camera, and a completely manual camera. It takes a battery. The battery works the light meter, but you don't need the light meter to use the camera. As far as the shutter and the winding and everything else, everything works just fine without a battery. Now, some people will say there's a problem with this because this camera was made to use the old 1.35 volt button cell batteries, and they don't make those anymore. I think they make some in China, but they're really crummy batteries, and they'll just, who knows if they're going to fall apart in your camera. I wouldn't mess with them. But all you have to do, you can use a regular 1.5 volt button cell battery, 357 ever ready. You put that in there, and you just set your ASA, which goes in here on the shutter speed dial. There's a little window for it. Yep. You set the shutter speed, the film sensitivity, film speed, one stop slower. Set that one stop slower, and the extra 0.15 volts that's coming from the battery will jump it up one f-stop. So if you're going to put 400 film in it, you're going to put the setting for ASA 200. If you want to put 200 film in it, you'll set it for ASA 100. Like that. And that's mostly, I don't think we have Kodachrome 25 anymore. That you'd have to set it for ASA 12, but this actually takes the sensitivity of ASA 12 film. You can put ASA 12 in it if you could find any, but you won't find any today, not that I know of. Maybe online, I don't know. So this is what I would recommend to anybody wanting to start out in analog photography. It will make you do all the work to get your exposure, and it will make you rely on yourself to do your own photography, and don't just say, all right, I'm going to push the button, hope this takes a picture, wonder what it's going to be. You get to do all of the creative stuff yourself, and you get to learn what photography is really about, and it's about the lowest price you can find anything out there. And guess what? It's most likely still going to be working, because these things just go and go and go. I figure that a Minolta SRT 202 probably has a shelf life of 150 to 200 years. So that's going to outlast me and a lot of generations after me. But that's our look at the Minolta SRT 202, the Minolta SRT series, and our look at their Minolta film cameras. I may be back with some more lens reviews. I've been picking up Minolta lenses lately, and I need some more here. I'm waiting for some other stuff to show up any day now. I think I got one coming tomorrow. But in the meantime, check out my channel, and I've got a whole photography playlist and a whole series on different Minolta film cameras, all auto manual focus, of course. So until the next time, this is Mr. Gibson Guy, and I'll see you later.